Hey, Assalamu alaikum and Juma
Alaikum salam.
Mubarak, wherever you are. Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. This presentation of mine is based on one of my theses I have written on Mustafa Sabri Effendi a while ago. And the presentation has two parts. I will try to summarize the first part and read a section from the second part. Uh, um, um, and yeah, we can discuss relevant further points in the Q&A session, I guess. As for the first part, it's about the conception of causality. So there are two levels, one can say, of causality that needs to be differentiated, especially in Mustafa Sabri Effendi's thought. And Sabri's whole goal, actually, in all of his discussions with all the different thinkers from the East to the West, to give names like including Mullah Sadra, Hume, Locke, and Kant, is actually to defend the principle of sufficient reason, the PSR, and to deny any kind of secondary causation as a very, let's say, consistent and loyal occasionalist. And this is especially important in his discussion with Hume and Kant, because Mustafa Sabri Effendi himself positions himself between both, between Hume and Kant. And he also says this very explicitly, that the truth is between the both. Because while Hume denies both levels of causality or of causation, namely divine or like primary causation and secondary causation, Kant is extremely, let's say, insistent on trying to defend both. And just to give you a kind of quick overview, in order to get the sense of what Mustafa Sabri Effendi tries to do in his project, this is the end result of his whole discussions. So there are maybe 5 important questions to be asked. And all the, let's say, green signs are like Mustafa Sabri Effendi's partial agreements with Kant as opposed to Hume, and all the blue signs are his let's say partial agreements with Hume as opposed to Kant. While Mustafa Sabri Effendi himself thinks like considers Hume to be more consistent than Kant, also because of their common empiricist basis. But now coming back to my other points, the third point in my thesis was or is about the discussion on the logical nature of the principle of sufficient reason, to which Mustafa Sabri Effendi refers briefly. And this is quite important insofar as it helps us situating his work within the Ash'ari paradigm. And then since the work is like quite scattered and written in a kind of unsystematic way. And here I draw like on like classical manuals like Imam Ghazali's Iqtisad or Imam Senusi's Sharh al-Kubra to elaborate on the discussion, to which Mustafa Sabri Effendi only refers briefly, and to get a sense of what the like logical nature means, or what it means to have a principle of, to consider the principle of sufficient reason to be, let's say, bedihi or burhani, as Mustafa Sabri Effendi says, or to be awwali or nadari, as the other both mentioned theologians call them. And this is quite fruitful or an important, let's say, parallel for the next chapter I have, namely how Kant basically categorizes the principle, like his causality principle within his thought. And I will, for like because of obvious reasons, I will skip Kant's fundamental epistemological claims in this discussion, also because they are actually quite basic and like, let's say, publicly known. Maybe 2 important points to make in this context. It is important to make this parallel, or to draw this parallel, because it shows us how similar the discussions on the principle of sufficient reason and its nature is in the East and West, and consequently that Mustafa Sabri Effendi, against many descriptions actually, understands major claims of Kant quite precisely and quite intuitively. And then we have the second part of the whole thesis, and on which, and that's the sixth chapter, on which, in which Mustafa Sabri Effendi comments on Hume and Kant, and he basically discusses their, let's say, philosophies together, also because he understands and knows that Kant was basically trying to respond to Hume. And then I will read a section from the seventh chapter, which as much as we can. And the eighth and the ninth chapter are basically Mustafa Sabri Effendi's construction, how he basically understands knowledge a posteriori and knowledge a priori, because his whole problem with Kant, to summarize that point, is that Kant, in Mustafa Sabri Effendi's eyes, downgrades knowledge a priori and upgrades a posteriori in invalid ways, and equates them actually in very essential ways. And that's the thing that Mustafa Sabri Effendi tries to combat throughout his discussion with Kant. And now we just gonna read a kind of section from an abridged version of the from the seventh chapter that is entitled Kant's Self-Refutation, ? Sabri sharply attacks Kant's claim that synthetic judgments a priori are dependent on knowledge a posteriori from another broader perspective, and again radically questions its validity. In this case, Sabri even accuses Kant of having an inconsistent epistemology that refutes itself. Once again, the Kantian checkup that limits the validity of a priori knowledge is at stake. In Mawqif al-Aql, Sabri states regarding Kant's position that that which reason proves without the participation of empirical knowledge is not constitutive is undoubtedly void. So this claim that Kant makes is undoubtedly void. For the mathematical and logical laws are pure rational laws. Moreover, Kant himself acknowledges these laws and that they are necessary. That is, that they are constitutive beyond constituted empirical circumstances. Kant, after all, even says himself, truly the difference between certain knowledge a priori and certain knowledge a posteriori is that the first is necessary and the second is not. And this is an unequivocal statement concerning the primacy of what has been identified by ratio over what has been identified by sense perception or empiricism. Thus, while criticizing what pure reason constitutes without empirical checkup, Kant objects other philosophers just as he contradicts himself. Since Sabri is relatively brief in this context as well, it remains the thankless task of the reader to interpret and decipher this dense argumentation. Apparently, Sabri claims to identify a self-refuting postulate in Kant's epistemology. According to Kant, on the one hand, no kind of a priori knowledge is valid that is not supported or verified by a posteriori knowledge. At the same time, however, the epistemological difference between a priori and a posteriori knowledge is recognized in the Kantian system, and the former is even granted primacy. Under these circumstances, then, how can knowledge a posteriori be at all capable of guaranteeing the validity of knowledge a priori? And how can that which goes beyond the possible sphere of experience of the human subject be excluded by reference to the non-existence of knowledge a posteriori? In this sense, the question seems to be how Kant actually comes to the conclusion that knowledge a priori is dependent on knowledge a posteriori, despite being epistemologically prior. It is this context in which Sabri accuses Kant of self-refutation. Now, this objection has to be situated in the light of Kant's edifice of thought. In a syllogistic scheme, the argumentation seems to be as follows. Sabri states that Kant asserts the following two propositions. A cognition a priori has a synthetic status only if it can appeal to an a posteriori checkup. And B, in the case of metaphysical knowledge, there cannot be such an a posteriori checkup. From this, it follows, C, metaphysical knowledge is inadmissible or at least inaccessible to the human subject. This actually corresponds to the Kantian argumentation. According to Kant, once one exceeds the limits of sensibility, as he calls it, There is no longer any theoretical knowledge given. It is precisely at this point that Sabri steps in and claims that Kant disproves himself when he disqualifies, quote, what pure reason constitutes without empirical checkup. Yet, according to Sabri, its categorical dismissal amounts to a self-refutation. For Sabri, apparently does not want to let the major premise pass readily. The implicit argumentation seems to be as follows. Like all cognition, the cognition formulated in the major premise can, according to Kant's own epistemology, only be a cognition a posteriori or a priori. Now we shall work through both possibilities. A. All cognition a priori that cannot invoke an a posteriori checkup is inadmissible. B. The cognition formulated in the major premise is a synthetic cognition a posteriori. From this, it follows, C, the cognition formulated in the major premise is circular. If the main insight that all cognition must be based on experience is itself also based on experience, then the argumentation is circular. However, this passage does not speak of circular reasoning, an accusation Sabri makes in another similar context, actually. Since Sabri speaks of a self-refutation, he apparently assumes that Kant does not consider the major premise as knowledge a posteriori, as this accusation only comes into effect if the major premise is understood as knowledge a priori. The argument then is as follows. All cognition a priori that cannot invoke an a posteriori checkup is inadmissible. And B, the cognition formulated in the major premise is a synthetic cognition a priori, which itself cannot invoke an a posteriori checkup. From this, it follows, C, the cognition formulated in the major premise is inadmissible. Against this backdrop, Sabri's accusation that Kant's epistemology refutes itself can be explained. If the major premise is understood as knowledge a priori, it is inadmissible according to its own criteria, since it cannot be supported by empirical evidence. The assertion that all knowledge necessarily emerges from the synthesis of understanding and intuition is not itself an example of such a synthesis. In other words, the Kantian insight that, quote, all genuine knowledge can only succeed at any time through the interplay of pure thought and experience is paradoxically not an interplay of pure thought and experience. Thus, Kant's insight that a priori knowledge is limited to the world of experience is not evidence-based knowledge, but a self-refuting because rational postulate. Sabri's overarching critique refers to Kant's most elementary assumptions. In Kant's scholarship, this kind of questioning is thus referred to as metacritique. It is these concerns about Kant's epistemology presented in chapter 7 that lead Sabri to consider Kant's reflections on knowledge a posteriori and a priori as unsubstantiated. Of all things, Sabri does not find a logically compelling argumentation in these fundamental principles of Kantian philosophy, namely to achieve universal and necessary knowledge through a posteriori knowledge and to reduce a priori knowledge to the world of experience. That's exactly the upgrade and downgrade I have referred to, that Kant basically tries to come up with a system that makes it possible to understand a posteriori knowledge as universal and necessary through the categories he's trying to establish within his thought. And at the same time, he reduces a priori knowledge to the world of experience and basically ends up equating a priori knowledge to a posteriori knowledge in all of their defining characters, actually. Consequently, and this is my last sentence, there is no possibility for Sabri to postulate natural causality, which has been dealt with in chapter 8, just as there is nothing to prevent him from pursuing scientific metaphysics with the principle of sufficient reason. And this has been dealt in chapter 9. And a section that I haven't elaborated on in this case is Sabri's actually, let's say, constant attempt to understand modern philosophy in light of ancient philosophy. And he keeps trying to make different connections between ancient Greek philosophers on the one hand and modern philosophers on the other hand. And one interesting like parallel that can be like worked out in this case is this very argumentation that Sabri applies to Kant's thought is very much found also in Imam al-Ash'ari's Maqalat al-Islamiyyin. And even if he doesn't do it in this very case in an explicit way as opposed to the other instances, that is another interesting parallel that I would love to work out in the full-fledged publication of this paper. As for relevant further discussions, to just give a last overview of this actually quite broad discussion, because one shall note that Sabri basically claims to have engaged with Kant with in a certain depth. He also says this explicitly, and also quantitatively speaking, this is basically true. Since he's quite, let's say, he takes it up with many people or many thinkers. I think Kant is the quantitatively most privileged philosopher Sabri engages with, also because of the fact that he understands Kant as a kind of inevitable reference in modern Western thought, and his main interlocutors, who are actually the Egyptian modernists, apparently keep referring to Kant, which forces Sabri to engage with modern philosophy, and above all with Kant in a certain depth. And Sabri has very different criticisms of Kant's epistemological claims. My very first thesis, my bachelor's thesis quite a while ago, worked on the second topic here, for example, which is Kant's transcendental idealism. And obviously the most, let's say, the biggest reason why Kant or Sabri is very focused on like denying Kant's understanding of causality is because of the cosmological proof of God, which is a whole chapter in his work, and all related discussions are also given in the context of Kant. For example, the impossibility of an infinite regress, and so on and so forth. But Sabri has also, let's say, a somewhat strategic interest in engaging with Kant, insofar as he knows that Kant is, in some ways at least, not atheistic as he has been understood, and tries to make room by referring to that fact against his modern interlocutors by saying that the very icon the modernists are following is actually someone who did believe in God. And these are somewhat, let's say, strategical and polemical elements within his discussion. But the whole work, for those who are familiar with it, actually is full of these kind of, let's say, interesting strategic steps where Sabri basically utilizes the different philosophers for his own ends. But I think I'm also I've also like reached my limit, but that's it from my side, and I'm looking forward to having a rich discussion with all of you, inshallah. Thank you very much.